As soon as you're ready, Ms. Daniel, we'll kick off.
Yes, we're ready.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third and final outreach session of this Economic Substance series. My name is Daniel Reese, and I'm a senior consultant with the Registrar of Companies. Mr. Kenneth Joaquin, the Registrar, could not be with us for this final session. However, on his behalf, I'd like to thank everyone for their patience and their feedback so far as we continue to update our Economic Substance portal. I'm joined today by Ms. Ann Daniels, the Head of Compliance for the Registrar of Companies, as well as Michael Frith, the Economic Substance Advisor. Before I hand over, I'd like to just provide a very brief update. Many of you will be aware of the changes we intended to make to the Economic Substance portal. As timing would have it, however, these changes have coincided with the implementation of the new registration system. That has created some unique challenges. Therefore, we've been very deliberate in making the changes, first to reduce the interruption to our industry stakeholders. Additionally, we have been learning a lot more about implementation of the Economic Substance regime, as well as the expectations from the OECD themselves, right, in terms of information gathering, etc. We therefore ask that you continue to be patient with us as we upgrade our systems and data collection efforts. There is a working group in place for the implementation of the registration system, and we will consider expanding that remit to include Economic Substance as we move forward with the changes in law. So I will now hand over to Ms. Daniels, who will proceed with the agenda.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending what's the last in our series of these updates. Just some housekeeping. I have seen that somebody's saying that the sound is muffled. If everybody has their video off and their sound muted, that sometimes helps. I'm not sure if we can do anything about that at the moment. Other than that, maybe it's just Daniel's. I think that might have been the issue. Thank you, guys. So just some other housekeeping. You'll see in the little chat box, the Q&A box. You can ask questions at any time by typing them in the Q&A section. What we'll do is try to look at them during the various presentations and try to, where the presenters can see them and feel like they are ready to answer them, they'll be able to answer them as they are speaking. After each presentation, what we'll try to do is have a little period that we can look at unanswered questions on those topics. But any questions that we don't get to in this session, we will add to our FAQ list, which we will put on the website in very shortly. I can't promise the exact date, but we are working on the FAQs and we'll put them out very shortly, hopefully before the end of the month. These questions, any questions you ask, please make sure they're not entity specific. It's not appropriate for us to be, number one, advising, and we don't think it's appropriate for your entity's personal information to be for the audience. George is not here. He was on vacation. I believe he's back today, but accordingly, I cannot answer specific questions on the system. I can answer a few questions with regard to ESD filings, and I'll address those in my presentation to you. Yeah, ES system questions are really not my purview, so please keep this for when George comes back. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Michael. Michael Frith has been invaluable to us in assisting us with some of the policy perspectives, and we've noticed a couple of things in filings that we thought we would want to reiterate and clear up for you, and misconceptions that we've seen in the filings. So over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Anne, and good morning, everyone. So yeah, as Anne indicated, there are a few sort of broad themes, broad sort of interpretive issues that we've seen arise, or the compliance team has seen arise during the course of the past year of filings, and I'll look to address those, some of the bigger ones here today. If you do have any questions on those in particular, or indeed any other sort of broad interpretation issues, policy related, please don't hesitate to, as Anne indicated, put those into the Q&A. The four topics that I'm be looking to address today specifically is the interpretation and definition of the concept of pure equity holding entities, also clarifying the interpretation of what it means to be a local entity for the purposes of economic substance. I'll talk a bit about non-resident entities, specifically in the context of the application of the analysis that's in the guidance notes currently related to tax transparent entities, where you're looking through to the owners, and then briefly discuss some issues that have come up in relation to entities that are in liquidation. So starting with pure equity holding entities. Broadly, what we've seen arise is there seems to be some confusion among some of those filing as to what it means to be a pure equity holding entity. What is required in order to meet that definition, and indeed in what circumstances would an entity fall outside of that definition. So the first thing I'll say is the definition of pure equity holding entity for the purposes of economic substance has a very specific meaning. And it is much more specific than the broader concept of holding entities, investment holding, which of course can be the principal business activity of a company, ignoring economic substance issues. But for economic substance purposes, pure equity holding entity has a very specific meaning. And there are essentially two elements that must be met. The first is that it must hold a controlling equity stake in one or more other entities. So it must be a controlling stake and an equity position. So for example, a debt interest or another contractual interest would not constitute a pure equity holding entity. And indeed, if it is only a minority or non-controlling stake in one or more other entities, it would also fall outside of the definition of pure equity holding. So that's issue number one. The one that seems to cause, and that seems to be broadly well understood. The second element of the definition is that the pure equity holding entity must be carrying on no other commercial activity. And this is the one that seems to have caused, where there's been confusion, this seems to be the source of it. Essentially, if the pure equity holding entity is carrying on any other commercial activity, and broadly speaking, although not specifically defined, but in broad terms, what this means is it's earning revenue from a source other than the dividends distributions received from the controlling stakes that it holds. So that might be another business line. It could be anything else. So any other commercial activity undertaken by the pure equity holding entity would take it outside of that definition. So must have a controlling stake and must be carrying on no other commercial activity. If the other commercial activity, if it is carrying on another commercial activity and that other activity is a relevant activity, then the entity will be in scope for that other relevant activity. It is not possible for an entity to be both a pure equity holding entity and to carry on another relevant activity, because by definition, it will fall outside that second requirement, that it carry on no other commercial activity. So to say a very, very specific definition. So take care not to conflate it with the broader commercial concept of say holding entities or investment holding, which is, let's say, a business activity. Right, so if there are any questions on that, please feel free to add those to the Q&A. Otherwise, I will move on to the discussion of local entities. Similar to what we've seen in relation to pure equity holding entities, what we've noticed is that there is some confusion among entities as to what is meant by the term local entity for the purpose of economic substance. And again, it is a very specific definition, specific to economic substance, and is different than the broader kind of Companies Act concept, for example, of a local company. So there are three elements that must be met in order for an entity to qualify as a local entity for the purpose of economic substance. The first is that it must be a local company, local LLC, that is subject to the 60/40 Bermudian ownership and control requirement. And if it is a partnership, it must have no non-Bermudian partners. So that's criteria number one. It must be a local company, local LLC, local partnership as understood generally, and it must be subject to that 60/40 ownership requirement or have no non-Bermudian partners. So for example, a local company that has a Section 114B license varying the 60/40 ownership requirement would not be a local entity for the purpose of economic substance. So that's criteria number one, subject to the Bermudian ownership and control requirements. Criteria number two is that it must carry on business only in Bermuda. So if it is carrying on business outside of Bermuda in some capacity, it would also fall outside the definition of local entity. So although it may be subject to the Bermudian ownership requirement, if it is carrying on business outside of Bermuda, it would not be a local entity for the purpose of economic substance. And then lastly, and this is the one that we found on technically seems to have caused the greatest level of confusion. The last requirement is that the local entity must not be part of an MNE group. And that has itself a very specific definition. So many of you may be familiar with the concept of an MNE group in the context of country by country reporting, the CBC regs. This definition is very similar to that. It is drawn from that with one very important distinction. If the Bermuda entity has an affiliate elsewhere, tax resident elsewhere, then it will fall within the definition of MNE group, an affiliate or a branch tax resident outside of Bermuda. That is very similar to the CBC definition, with the exception that under the CBC rules, the MNE group, there is a 750 million euro revenue threshold below which you would not fall within the definition. There is no revenue threshold for the purpose of economic substance. So if the Bermuda company is subject to the 60/40 ownership, so meets criteria number one, it is carrying on business only in Bermuda, meets criteria number two. But if it has an affiliate outside of Bermuda or operates a branch outside of Bermuda that is tax resident outside of Bermuda, then it will be part of an M&E group and therefore will not be a local entity for the purpose of economic substance. So again, must be majority owned and controlled by Bermudians, subject to the local ownership requirements, must carry on business only in Bermuda, and must not be part of an M&E group as defined in the Economic Substance Act. So we have seen some confusion regarding that definition. So again, if you have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to add those to the Q&A. Otherwise, I'll move on to discussion of non-resident entities. Non-resident entities, as a reminder, are those entities that can demonstrate that they are tax resident outside of Bermuda and therefore are not subject to meeting the economic substance requirements in Bermuda. I know Anne will talk a bit about some of the specific evidence filing requirements for that. So specifically what I'm looking to discuss here is the application of the tax transparency analysis, which has become a little bit more relevant now that partnerships without separate legal personality are now in scope of the legislation. By tax transparent, what we mean in this context is if all of the income from the entity's relevant activity is attributable to one or more of its partners, owners, shareholders, and those partners, owners, shareholders are tax resident in another jurisdiction and can evidence that, then the entity, even though it itself may not be tax resident in that jurisdiction if all of its income is attributable to one or more of its partners or shareholders in that jurisdiction and can evidence that, then it would qualify for non-resident entity status. The key principle here is that it must be, as it is for a non-resident entity generally, is that in order to qualify for that exemption, that carve out saying that you're not subject to the economic substance requirements in Bermuda, in order to qualify for that, it must be all of the income from the relevant activity must be liable to tax in that jurisdiction. So either through the entity directly or in a tax transparent entity through its partners or shareholders. If some portion of the income is not liable to tax in the foreign jurisdiction, for example, one or more of the partners, it's attributable to them, but they are not themselves tax resident elsewhere, it would not qualify for non-resident entity status. It's a very particular set of circumstances. It is addressed in the guidance notes. And again, if you have any questions about that specifically, please don't hesitate to ask. Moving on to the last topic I've been asked to address today. Very simply, it's in relation to entities that are in liquidation. So the basic principle, and again, this is addressed very briefly in the guidance notes already, but just a reminder that where an entity is in liquidation but has not yet been liquidated, as in it has not yet been wound up, for so long as it is in liquidation, it remains subject to the Economic Substance Act. So when the liquidator is appointed and assumes responsibility for the entity from the directors, for example, then the liquidator becomes responsible for ensuring that any necessary economic substance declaration filings are made, and indeed that the entity continues to operate in compliance with the Economic Substance Act. It is not until the entity ceases to exist, as in it is wound up, that it would no longer be subject to the economic substance requirements. So for long as it continues to exist and is in liquidation, but has not yet been liquidated, it remains subject to economic substance. So it's just a reminder on that point. Again, any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. But if there are none, or at least none yet, I will hand back over to Anne to go over some of the filing issues she's encountered.
Thank you so much, Michael. Again, I'm just going to go over, first of all, I'm going to go over some system issues. We are aware that some people have been unable to make an ES filing. The indications for those that inability to file are for multi-currency share entities, ISACs and ISACs, and a few entities that failed to come over in the data transfer from the old system to the new. We're aware of those. There are not that many, but we do realize that you have not been able to file. For those entities, we are taking steps to have a paper filing. Those entities will not be penalized or regarded as having made late filings because it is our issue. You notice we have extended the deadline on the December 31st, 2020 year-end filings because we don't intend to penalize you for our system issues. We extended the deadline, and in extending that deadline, we did take off the flag that would have indicated that the filings were late, but the one flag that we didn't take off was the file that required the entity declaration to go for review. So many of you will have noticed that you will not get an acknowledgement of your filing. You won't get anything indicating that you filed, even though you have pressed that submit button. We are aware of all those filings. That feature enables us to look at any filing that has been filed late and not release it not acknowledge it until an actual technical officer has looked at it. But we will, once you press submit, it's very unlikely that your submission has not been received, but we are endeavoring to acknowledge all receipts of all filings as necessary. any entities that don't have specific system filing issues, if you have not filed, you will be adjudicated late. The only reasons for, you've got 6 months within which to make that filing. So unless there's a system issue, it's expected that the filing has been made on time. Access to the economic substance declarations. Prior to the go live, the economic substance declaration was a kind of a standalone application requiring zone authorization to have access to that. With the go live, the ESD has been integrated as a filing under the e-registry. So access to ESD can now only be achieved through access to the e-registry. So everyone is fully aware of how to gain access to the e-registry. First of all, it has to have entity authorization, then CSP authorization, if for the actual person who is going to make the filing. One of the things that's been very important to the registrar of companies is the access to information and the availability of information. We want to be sure that only authorized people can access that information. We don't want people, especially now that the ESD is part of the e-registry, it's more important for us now to ensure that that information is kept as confidential as possible, because prior to that, that specific information was not available even for corporate service providers who have access to the registry system to see. So in an effort to streamline, the way the process should have worked was that the entity should have provided us authorizing a CSP to conduct on their behalf. The CSP would then authorize individuals to conduct on their behalf, etc. We recognize that this would have been an awfully long process and would have had the system down for longer than we would have liked. So in order to streamline things, we just allowed the corporate service providers to provide a list of entities for which they're authorized, and as a starting point, rather than having the entities provide that first authorization. So now what we're doing is a retroactive verification of the entity authorization. Some of you will have already received requests for the authorizing documents. What we're looking for is things like service agreements, service level agreements, corporate resolutions, etc. Anything that evidences that the entity has authorized the corporate service provider to act on their behalf with the registrar of companies. I recognize that this is causing some angst for some of you because some of the service agreements are not necessarily as detailed as you would like, but at this stage we understand that and we are happy to accept what you have in existence. But we do encourage you to, when you're reviewing your contracts, to ensure that they do provide specific details, because that kind of thing actually is useful information when we are reviewing the adequacy of the support provided by corporate service providers. So it helps to understand exactly what it is that they require, you're requiring, an entity is requiring a corporate service provider to do. But in this instance, what we're looking for is any document that authorizes that is provided by the entity that demonstrates that somebody else has been authorized to act on its behalf. Any questions? There is no regulatory requirement for a CSP to undertake any economic substance activities. Therefore, if we simply send an email to our clients, will that suffice? I'm not quite sure what that question is about.
Yeah, I was looking at that as well. It's definitely unclear. But just sort of following up from, there was a question that appeared just prior to that, and just because I know it's something that's come up in different ways, I think that the answer may be, interpreting the question, the answer may be that the CSP is not, by virtue of being a CSP, under any obligation, subject to any contractual arrangements that may be in place, is not under any obligation to make any filings on behalf of the entity. If they choose to do that, that's a matter of contract, and I think has discussed that, and should be taken up with the entity. But it is, as it is with any other compliance matter, We would encourage CSPs to ensure that their clients are fully informed about their economic substance filing obligations, but that does not mean that those obligations necessarily extend to the CSP unless they've specifically agreed to take them on somehow and have been authorized to do so by the client. So not sure if that answers the question, but I do know that's an issue that comes up.
Thank you, Michael. People have been saying that they have been unable to see past economic substance filings. This is generally an issue of access, so you need to be sure that you understand the access and the authorization in order to be able to see the economic substance filing. If the economic substance filing, the first one was done by another corporate service provider, and a new corporate service provider is now the authorized person, then once the authorization on the e-registry has been changed, the new corporate service provider will be able to see the past filings. Okay. There is one issue we have noticed of document limit. Currently, there's an inability to upload more than one document to the ES portal. We're aware of this issue until it's addressed. Please always provide additional documents to the compliance team using the ROC compliance email box. Any information that you want to provide to the compliance team should be provided by the ROC compliance email box, not to individual people. You can copy individual people in if you like, but the main place that you should be sending information to is the ROC compliance box. It is the only way that you can be sure that it will get acted on. You know, people may be on vacation, not pass it on for several various reasons. You could miss something on an individual email, but the ROC compliance email box is checked scrupulously. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it on system issues. If there are no more questions on system issues, I'll move on to, I see one more. Our entities for which we do ROC filings include our subsidiaries. Is proof of being appointed as secretary of an entity sufficient evidence of the authority to do these ROC, including ES filings?
And my answer to that is it depends on the nature of the arrangement with that CSP. So I think that the technical answer to the question is mere appointment as secretary does not in and of itself confer the authority to make an economic substance filing per se. It may form part of the overall services agreement that the entity has in place, but simply being appointed secretary doesn't necessarily confer the authority. So it is something that we would encourage you to discuss carefully with your client and ensure that they are comfortable with the information that you're providing, recognizing that the nature of the information that must be provided as part of that economic substance filing is necessarily typically more detailed than the CSP would ordinarily have. And so they would need to discuss with the client a lot of that information in any event. So short answer, ensure that it's clear with your client what authority you have before indicating that you have that authority.
Filing issues. I think I shouldn't say, one thing that I think it needs to be clarified is in circumstances where you're acting for a group of the group companies only, you're not required to be licensed as a corporate service provider. Sent me some of the instances where there is some confusion about authorization, etc. But those are some of the cases where if you need to demonstrate that the group has appointed you as secretary and with authorization to conduct the corporate secretarial work, which includes ES filings. That's the kind of thing that we would expect to see. Okay, if there are no more questions on system issues, I'll move to filing issues. We have had numerous incidences where people have said, I submitted and I need to change something, or I made a mistake, or I made an error. Can I get the filing back? No, you can't. Once you press submit, that is a final declaration. It's a legally binding document, and it's a signed declaration. So before you press submit, be sure that you really understand what you put there. If there are questions, you can always print the document. If somebody else needs to approve it, that can be done in several ways. But before you press submit, be sure that you really know that the information there is accurate, is what you want to submit, because it is a final document. If you have made an error before you press submit, you can always go back and change it. You can save it. You can do lots of kinds of things. But once you have pressed that submit button, it's gone, and it's a final declaration. If you've submitted something with errors and you've recognized that about 5 seconds after you press that submit button, go back to the RSC compliance email box and let us know. We don't recommend it. We don't want it to happen this way, but we recognize that, especially in this first instance, people have had some issues. So we will take a look at what's provided. But in as much as possible, remember that that declaration is a binding declaration.
Sorry, Ann, just to interrupt just for a moment, because I think it's worth saying, in relation to ensuring that the declaration is something that the entity is satisfied with, that they're comfortable that they're not making a false declaration, and because it's a bit of an extension to what we talked about already in relation to the CSB or whoever may be authorized to make the filing. We would encourage entities where there is any question as to the interpretation of the filing requirements. Do they apply to you? How do they apply to you? Do you have the authorization to do this? Perhaps it goes without saying, but it is nonetheless worth pointing out that it's worthwhile to seek independent legal advice about that. If you have any questions, there are some of these interpretive questions, particularly those that I raised earlier, that could well be avoided if there was better advice received at the outset. It is a complex regime, and it is onerous in that respect. But with some clear advice, a lot of these matters of confusion can probably be avoided. So do seek advice if you have any lack of clarity. Sorry, Ann.
That's fine. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I agree totally. And it's we do get lots of what I call entity-specific questions. It is not for the registrar to make decisions or give advice on particular individual entities. That is something that the business is expected to be able to get legal advice and etc. on the structure and those kinds of things. So please always seek legal advice if you have questions before making filings. Additional information. Sometimes you might need us to know something that's not reflected in the fields in the economic substance declaration. You'll be aware that we are making, that we recognize that the portal does need to provide additional information. Previously, we've sent these out by supplemental questionnaires. The portal will be changed to include additional information gathering fields. However, in the interim, if there's something that you think that's important for us to know in the analysis of in the assessment of your declaration, you can put it in the notes field. Remember, the notes field is very limited. I think it has only like 1,000 characters. So this is not information that's, just want to give us, tell us what's happening with your entity. It has to be very specific information that we would need to be able to assess the declaration properly. So be judicious in the use of the field, but in the interim, while we are upgrading the portal, this is where you can put additional information. If you are if the field is not large enough for you to put information in it that you want us to know, or if there is additional information that we've asked for, please submit to the RSC compliance email box. Again, that's the only place we can be sure that it will get the attention that it deserves. One other issue that we've noticed is that if you have an entity that has conducts more than one relevant activity, if one of those relevant activities has generated nil gross revenue for the year, we've noticed that if that entity and its relevant activity are put in first, then the second relevant activity is not able to be added. We are aware of this. So in this case, we are asking for entities who are conducting more than one relevant activity with one activity that has generated no revenue for that year. Please put the first relevant activity that should be documented in the ESD is the relevant activity that actually got gross revenue for the year. Please put in the notes that that you have another relevant activity that generated no gross revenue, and we will address that when we review the submission. So again, if you have more than one relevant activity and one activity has no gross income, always put in first the relevant activity that had gross revenue. Please, I correct myself, gross revenue, not gross income. Okay. Any questions on that? Nope. Okay, this is going quite swiftly. One of the issues that we have come across is that through the declaration you are asked questions on number of FTEs, premises, etc., etc. We have had several submissions where people have claimed no FTEs, for example, and no premises, but when they get to the declaration, they say that they have fully complied with economic substance obligations. Just to be clear, if you do not comply with one or more of the economic substance obligations, you do not comply. Complying with one of the obligations does not mean you comply. You have to comply with all of them. So please make sure that you understand the obligations before you make the filing. If you have any questions, again, always revert to your legal advice. They should be able to let you know. Last one is evidence of tax residency. We come across lots of filings where people are unable to provide evidence of tax residency for the relevant year. We recognize that this is an issue. If there's been a tax filing, it may not have been acknowledgement of that from the tax authorities may not be receivable within a reasonable time. We're aware of these and we are considering them. However, we must be clear that the evidence of the filing needs to come from the tax authority. They should have some acknowledgement, some receipt, etc., that they can provide for you. If there have not been taxes filed, you just need to demonstrate that you are subject to tax in that jurisdiction during the relevant year. And that's all I have on my list. Are there any other questions?
It's like the Q&A box is empty.
This is
clearly.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you all for your attending. As I said, the FAQs hopefully will be up shortly. And I believe this has been recorded so that these will be available on our website in due course. At any time you want to contact us, we're available for advice, but not specific entity-specific advice. Always consult your lawyers for that. I think, and if nobody else has any more questions, thank you for your attendance. We look forward to receiving more of them. This has been a full year of receipts of economic substance filings, and it's a work in progress. We look forward to working with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.